start my talk about Byzantine iconoclasm of the 8th and 9th century, I want to make sure that the terms which I'm going to use often are clear from the beginning. So here are some terms which I will use often during my presentation. Proto image, in Russian первообраз, the one who is depicted. Christ, Theotokos, saints, image, icon. Iconoclast, in Russian иконоборцы, those who are against icons. Iconophiles, иконопочитатели, those who venerate icons. And finally, hypostasis, in Russian hypostasis, that which distinguishes one person from another. Russian word personality, личность, is close to Greek hypostasis. Historic background. In 726, the Byzantine Emperor Leo III Syrian ordered the removal of the ancient portrait of Christ that had been prominently placed on the gate of the imperial palace. This event marked the outbreak of what is known as Byzantine iconoclasm. The removal of the image was followed by a prohibition against placing icons in public places. Moreover, even the possession of icons were prohibited. In 754, Iconoclastic Council of Lilia placed a strict ban on icons, making it the subject of royal law. What were icons to the Byzantine iconoclast, and what did icon worshipping look like in their lives? Few texts by iconoclasts survived the defeat of the movement in Byzantine Empire. However, the iconoclasts were extensively quoted by iconophiles in their apologies for the images. My analysis of their view is based on those texts. The duration of the conflict also highlights the importance of the Byzantine iconoclastic disputes. In 726, iconoclasm became the official policy of the Byzantine Empire. The first iconoclastic period was ended by the Second Council in Nicaea in 787. It was followed by a brief icon restoration under the impressed Irene. Iconoclasm was not actively brought back until the reign of Leo V the Armenian, who was crowned in 813. The second period of iconoclasm began similarly as the first period did, with the removal of the icon of Christ from the gate by Leo's soldiers. The parallels between the first period and second period are remarkable. Both were started by an Eastern emperor named Leo, who crowned his son Constantine, and both were ended by a widow empress acting as regent on behalf of her young son. In 843, Theodora organized a celebration of Orthodoxy, which is still celebrated by Orthodox Church on the first Sunday of Grand Lent. This is what we celebrate today. This marks the end of the second period of iconoclasm. In total, Byzantine debates concerning the nature of visual images took up more than 100 years. So, existing explanation. My explanation, which I discussed in my dissertation, was based on different approaches to a portrait of a person. What image depicts? When iconographers depict Christ, Theotokos, saints, what they're trying to depict. So my explanation is based on very different approaches to image of Christ, of saints, of Theotokos, which was proposed by iconophiles and iconoclasts. But there are other explanations. So before I talk about my explanation, I want to briefly mention what other explanations exist. So the first one, political explanation of the heresy, why it took place in Byzantine Empire. Some scholars looked instead for the political explanation of the issue's real underlying forces. Sociologists argued that Byzantine iconoclasm was in fact primarily a conflict of state and church interests. The idea that the reforms of Leo III were directed against the expansion of monasteries rather than icons per se became popular among Russian Byzantologists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries under the influence of Karl Marx. Second explanation, Christological explanation of Byzantine iconoclasm. Byzantine iconoclasm was a monophysite heresy. This approach to iconoclasm was proposed by participants in the iconoclastic disputes themselves. Patriarch Nicephorus considered iconoclasm to be a campaign against incarnation. At the Seventh Ecumenical Council, it was stressed that the heresy of Nestorius was irreconcilable with the paintings of icons. The theme of monophysitism touches the status of manhood in Christ, and as a consequence, the legitimacy of Christ's visual representation. The monophysites downgraded Christ's manhood, the notion of his material existence, and thus turned with disdain from visual representations. The proponents of the Christological explanation have made an important contribution to the study of Byzantine iconoclasm, revealing the link between the role of the Vladimir, the material, and the legitimacy of visual representation. And finally, the third explanation, Islamic influence. Some scholars attribute the official Byzantine iconoclasm to Islamic influence. Instead, indeed, the two iconoclastic edicts came out within a short period of time. The edict of the Caliph Yazid II in 721 and the edict of the Byzantine Emperor Leo III in 726. It's believed that Islam shared a negative attitude toward the representation of human figure, which was presumably influenced either by Judaism or by native Syrian or Coptic Christians, who never indulged in pictorial representation of human beings. Iconoclastic views. For the early iconoclast of the 8th century, the only true image was Eucharist. During the second period of iconoclasm in the 9th century, the true image was proclaimed to be the quote, man endowed with the Christian virtues, end quote. The only genuine representation of the saints was the imitation of their virtues and accomplishment of their commandments. The iconoclastic texts call for remembering God in one's heart, with words being images of Saint Soul, and to study holy writing, which are the living images of a godly life and inspiration for the emulation of godlike behavior. The 16 anathema of the First Iconoclastic Council condemns all those who set up images of saints with material power rather than reproducing their virtues as living images. Similarly, the Second Iconoclastic Council advises keeping logos in one's soul, holding likeness in one's heart, following the commandments as images for imitation, and being reminded of the saints with the written records rather than colors. For the iconoclast, the icon of Christ attempts to replace Christ, and thus to cause idolatry. Constantine V, an iconoclastic emperor, saw the only possible solution. The icon should be identical with its original, with the one who is represented in the icon. In essence, his quote, a good representation is essentially identical with the representative. Representation should not be like the original, but it rather be essentially the same. Only then would there be no risk for substitution, no chance of idolatry. But this narrowed down the choice of acceptable representation to the extent that for Constantine V, iconoclastic emperor, the only possible icon of Christ was Eucharist. An icon, according to this line of thinking, is simply a dead idol, not an image of living God. This argument that only that which is alive can represent the living being is not excluded though to the Byzantine iconoclasts. It was a common belief in the Muslim world at that time. The iconoclastic arguments about the difference between the dead manufactured essence of the icon and the living God assigned an inferior status to everything material. Thus, some arguments in favor of icons were based on the defense of the material in general. John of Damascus, the defender of icons, wrote, "Do not abuse matter, for it is not dishonorable. This is the view of Manichaeus." This is a quote from his 3 treatises on the divine images, a kind of a hymn, in fact, to the material. According to iconoclast, icons are therefore still more useless since they are able to express only the futile appearance, which is not worth remembering. The quote, "We should not endeavor to depict on board with colors the carnal faces of the saints. We do not need this." End of the quote. The soul and spirit which can only truly represent the saint and which are truly worthy of remembering are not present in the icons. The iconoclasts believe that the material technique of iconography is not able to represent the complex nature of a living being. It is invisible, soul or the divinity. According to the Byzantine iconoclast, the pictorial representation of likeness divides the complex nature of a living being because it represents only the insist on the impossibility of depicting the divine. What is then eligible for representation of a living being? What would be a comprehensive image? So the discussion revolved around the question, are pictorial images eligible for representation of a living being? The iconoclast's response was negative. The iconoclast proposed 3 types of true images that may represent the invisible. So follow the logic here. Since icons try to represent the invisible, the divinity or soul, of course appearance cannot represent the invisible, so the answer can't represent Christ, saints, or Theotokos. So if they believe that image tries to represent something invisible, divinity or soul, what then can represent the invisible, the divinity? It naturally brought them to the following definition of image. It can be a cross, something symbolical, or ethical, image, virtues, saints, biographers, deeds, or verbal, logos, the word of God. Symbols, deeds better represent the invisible, the divinity. Oppositely, the Orthodox Council prohibited symbolical representation of Christ. The quote from the Council. In some venerable icons, pointed to by the finger of the forerunner, there is the drawing of a lamb which has been received as the figure of grace, making what is for us the true lamb, Christ our God, glimmer through the law. Although therefore we totally embrace the old forms and figures as symbols and foreshadowings which have been handed down to the Church, yet we prefer to honor grace and truth because we have welcomed this as the fulfillment of the law. We therefore decree that the human figure of Christ, the Lamb of our God, who has taken away the sins of the world, be painted with colors as perfectly as possible, in view of everyone, and from now on be reinstated in icons in the place of the former Lamb. This way, we may perceive the height of humility of God the Word, and be led to the remembrance of His conduct in flesh, His suffering, His redemptive death, and the salvation which resulted for the world. End of the quote. In contrast, the Iconoclast Council in the area accepted only symbolic representation. Next, I'm going to talk about idolatry. So, iconoclasts and iconophiles view idolatry differently. They have different perception of what is idolatry, who are the pagans. And understanding how they view idolatry can help us understand these 2 different approaches, iconoclastic approach and iconophile approach. So both iconoclasts and iconophiles consider pagans to be idolaters. The critique of the pagans, in fact, might have been a potential meeting point between the 2 movements. But again, they both viewed idolatry differently. Pagan practices bothered them in different ways. The iconoclast understood idolatry as substitution of the living God with the dead material representations. Iconoclasts blamed iconophiles for worshipping icons instead of God, just as pagans confused statues with God. To the iconophiles, pagan idolatry was wrong not because it involved material representation, but because it praised non-existing gods, something conceived by an unrestrained imagination. Challenged by accusation of idolatry of replacing God with material representations, iconophiles developed a unique dialectics of image, an icon or a portrait, and proto-image, the one who is depicted. An image is identical with its proto-image in likeness and name, and at the same time it is different from its proto-image in essence. The distinction precluded possibility of replacement, and therefore idolatry. From the responses of the iconophiles themselves, we can see that iconoclasts charged them with the pagan practice of worshipping worthless material, the wood and paint of which the icon is made, in place of God. But even the pagans emphasized that their statues were not gods themselves, but rather their representations. A known pagan Plutarch, for instance, warned of overlay identifying the gods with their statues. For the iconophiles, pagan idolatry was not a replacement of gods by the material statues. iconoclasts identified pagans as idolaters not because of the fondness of the material representation, but because they were fond of the wrong representations. In other words, the iconoclast understanding of idolatry stressed not the material representation, but the subject of the representation. Who is represented? Did he or she really exist? The defenders of icon replied to idolaters. We have, however, make images of men who have existed and had bodies, the servants of God, so that we may remember them and reverence them. And we do nothing incongruous in depicting them such as they have been. We do not invent anything as you do, nor do we exhibit the physical portraits of certain incorporeal beings. In this way, iconophiles identified idols as the representation of non-existing gods. An icon apologist, Patriarch Nicephorus, characterized the idol as something non-existent and having neither form nor appearance. It is clear from this position why the iconophiles felt that the incarnation, God's existence as a man, precluded the risk of idolatry. Icons, unlike the idol's depiction of something non-existent. An icon is a visual representation of a historical person, and therefore should never be confused with an idol. Iconophiles clearly defined idolatry at the Seventh Ecumenical Council. The quote, "For what is an idol?" asks the apostle. "For what is the food offered to idols? But that which the Gentiles sacrifice to demons and not to God." End of the quote. Both definitions of idols given by iconophiles, the representation of something non-existent, and the representation of demons, focus on one who is represented, not the material of representation or the fact of representation existence. It is the subject here that is important. Whether something really exists or is simply the product of the artist's imagination is what distinguishes an icon from an idol. Dialectic of sameness and difference. The materiality of representation was the objection of the iconoclasts. They believed that it was first necessary to do something with the material before it became worthy of representing God. However, they argued there is no prayer powerful enough to raise material from its worthless status, thus it can never truly be worthy of God's representation. In response to this critique, the iconophiles insisted that the close links between an image and its proto-image made the image worthy of respect. Again, at the Seventh Ecumenical Council, they stated, "Many of the sacred things which we have at our disposal do not need prayer of sanctification, since their name itself says that they are all sacred and full of grace." So in the old church there was no tradition to sanctify icons. They were considered sanctified because they bear the name of God, they depict God. Arguing that respect was owed to icons, rejecting accusations of idolatry, the iconophiles referred to the practice of honoring imperial images. This practice was beyond any suspicion. The portraits of emperors could be seen anywhere. Patriarch Nicephorus was surprised by the inconsistency of the iconoclast. No, on one hand, they complied with the practice of honoring the imperial image. On the other hand, they regarded icon worshipping as idolatrous. This practice of honoring imperial images implied that the portrait of an emperor is identical with the emperor himself. The relationship between the emperor and his portrait became the model which iconophiles used to explain the relationship between icons and those who are depicted in the icons. At the Seventh Ecumenical Council, they summarized the quote, "Drawing upon the Holy Fathers, the honor of the icon is conveyed to the prototype. When one looks at the icon of a king, he sees the king in it. Thus, he who bows to the icon bows to the king in it, for it is his form and his characteristics that are on the icon." End of the quote. The relationship between an image and its proto-image had already been established in the 4th century by the bishop, later Saint Athanasius of Alexandria. His text on imperial images was quoted by John of Damascus, Theodore the Studite, and Patriarch Nicephorus to further support the dialectic of equality and difference between image and the one who is depicted in the image. The quote, "One might understand this more closely from the example of the image of the emperor. For the form and image of the emperor is exact. So that one who sees the image sees the emperor in it. And again, one who sees the emperor understands that this is in the image. From that fact, the likeness is not changed. The image might say to one who, after the image, wished to see the emperor, I and the emperor are one, for I am in him and he is in me. And what you have seen in me, this is you see in him. And what you have seen in him, this is you see in me. For the one who venerates the image venerates indeed the emperor, for his shape and form is the image. End of the quote. All the iconoclasts knew, of course, that disrespect shown to the imperial image could carry the death penalty. The iconophiles criticized the iconoclasts for the inconsistency of the argument, that they saw iconography as the worship of the lifeless material representations, even while honoring the portraits of the emperor. Were not the portraits of the emperor like icons nothing but wood, paint, wax? Why then did the iconoclasts venerate these portraits? The iconophiles insisted that honoring a pictorial image was reasonable because the honor shown to say the portrait of an emperor was actually being directed to the monarch himself, not the material of his representation. The quote, and as he who reviles the icon of the king is justifiably subject to punishment for having actually dishonored the king, even though the icon is nothing but wood and paints mixed and blended together with wax, so does he who dishonors the figure of any of these saints transfer the insult to him whose figure is on the icon. Even the very nature of things teaches that when an icon is dishonored, it is certainly the prototype. The one who is depicted is dishonored. In summary, the image is identical to proto-image in name and likeness, so the honor shown to the image is transmitted to its proto-image. The iconophiles will never claim an absolute equality of image and proto-image. As I have mentioned, they dismissed any possibility of an equality of essence. It was the iconoclast, in fact, who insisted that the only way to avoid idolatry to circumvent the substitution of the proto-image with their images was to make the image absolutely identical in every respect, including material, to its proto-image. Patriarch Nicephorus regarded this approach as illogical. An image will always be different from its proto-image in essence. The absolute association of an image and its proto-image ignores the difference between them, so the very concept of image is annihilated. An image shares only the likeness of its proto-image. The essence will always be different. A proto-image is alive and able to reason and move, while an image is inanimate, motionless, and unable to think. An image and its proto-image are therefore only the same in likeness, but different in essence. A visual image can share only the likeness of its proto-image. The misunderstanding lay in the very ways the iconophiles and iconoclasts thought. Iconoclasts challenged the iconophiles by asking what precisely is painted in an icon, presuming that either of the two possible responses, body or soul, would constitute a heresy. However, the iconophiles argued that they depicted neither body nor soul, but what they saw. They by no means pretended that icons were able to represent the invisible God of the soul. The quote, for if we were to make an image of the invisible God, we would really see him, for it is impossible to depict the one who is incorporeal and formless, invisible, and uncircumscribable. Another quote, I don't depict the invisible divinity, but I depict God made visible in the flesh. End of the quote. Again, these statements express the visual realism of the iconophiles. They boldly depicted only that which they saw. If something was visible, it could be legitimately represented. Iconographs depicted neither body nor soul, but what they saw, hypostasis, the person himself. There is a recognizable dualism of body and soul in the iconoclastic position. The iconophile recognized no such dualism. The visual image is identical with a person in his hypostasis, whether he is alive or dead. The memory of a person is inseparable from his portrait, which never ceases to show that person's hypostasis. The visual image is present in a person, and in turn it serves a historical testimony of that person's existence. The iconoclastic refusal to depict historical figures could possibly lead to a situation where the very existence of the figure might become uncertain. In this case, no image equals no person. From this perspective, suffering, his redemptive death. Yeah, it would be probably a good point to stop, but I want to bring some practical conclusions from this talk. Since we believe that icon is the same in likeness with the one who it depicts, with God, Theotokos, and the saints. So important conclusions which I wanted you to bring home. Iconoclastic acts in everyday routine. So what iconoclastic acts we should avoid in our everyday life? Holy images on the Easter plastic eggs covering. So think about it, that if there is this plastic covering with image of God, and to break the egg you need to tear away the image of Christ. Or another example, holy images inappropriately disposed in the garbage, including children drawings with drawings of saints, Theotokos, and God. Or a bag which inappropriately put on an icon, or on a book which has on the front page the icon of Christ. So just wanted to bring some practical conclusions from my presentation. So thank you for your attention.
So what do we do with them?
Let's have, before we break up, let's have a couple of questions. For instance, John just had one as we were clapping. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. And if it's possible to have a nice quiet conversation, we will try to do that.
Yeah, so what we are doing with the drawings, for example, of our children at home, we have a drawer where we keep all these images, including drawings of children. If they want to draw a saint or a god, we put them there, and when we got the full pile of such images, we put them in a paper bag and bring them to the altar so they are disposed appropriately.
So we're happy to do that for everyone, not just for Vershynins. Whoever would like to, because sometimes we get a paper icon, it gets ripped or something happens to it, and this is also, I think, important with copies of the Bible or of other writings on it, writings that have God's name and so on and so forth. They should be disposed of appropriately, and the best way to do that is to bring it to church, and we will take care of it. Sean?
So my understanding is that it also includes our calendar that we get here at the church, and the tear away pages.
Exactly.
For January, February, March.
Yes.
We tear away the page, and we should not throw it in the recycling or garbage.
Well, for sure not in the garbage. I don't know. Recycling is something kind of new from the church's point of view. You know, we've been around for a couple thousand years, and so we're still thinking about what that means. But it would be ideal not to throw that in the garbage. I would agree. I mean, I think that what Vershynins do is smart. They kind of have a place. They've got a plan. You know, you just grab the bag on your way out the door, and our boys are always happy to have more things to burn, quite frankly. And so it's it benefits everyone in that way. I saw another hand, John.
Can someone clarify for me briefly? I'm a little bit confused about how Neoplatonism informed the conflict here with the metaphysical ideas about the proto-image versus the, our reality, and like which side is sort of more Platonist or not.
Yeah, Neoplatonic approach that you can, looking at a person, you can read from just his image some inner essence of this person. And it's close to Iconoclast, who believe that image should represent the soul of the person, some invisible characteristics, the divinity. In this way, Iconoclasts are very close to Platonic approach. And it's different from Iconophiles. I call Iconophiles approach visual realism. You do not represent something invisible, some ungraspable soul, but what we see hypostasis, this nice Greek word hypostasis, in Russian lичность. We depict those who we saw. We saw Christ, we depict him, not his body, not his soul, we depict Christ himself, the person.
Yeah, but we also depict God the Father on some icons.
So this is a very controversial thing, and Strictly speaking, we can't depict God the Father. It's not possible. I mean, from the church's point of view, when you see images of the New Testament Trinity, which are controversial, it's actually Christ and the Holy Spirit as a dove, because the Ancient of Days is Christ. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Father Michael once said something, and then maybe Lilia has something.
I'm sorry, Russian Staglavy Sabor prohibited representation of Father God.
That's what I was just going to say. Staglavy Sabor 1550, I believe it was, condemned depicting God the Father. But I've seen some icons in iconography in like the American Orthodox Church, where, as Father mentioned, they have Christ depicted twice. Once as the young man that we know as 32-year-old young man, and then the exact image of Christ, but with a gray beard and a gray white hair and all that. So that might be one way to get around it.
Strictly speaking, in the Russian Church still, to have a New Testament Trinity icon, you should have the bishop's blessing. So we have one in the altar because someone wanted to give one. Lilia had to bless for that. I can't just go and do that. Well, I could, but that would not be a very good idea on my part. Methodius is going to have some bad thing happen to him.
I wanted to, there's another Greek word that comes into the discussion periodically, it's parousia. Whenever we see icons, holy images, crosses, anything like that, what we understand, we may not perceive immediately, but it's the very presence of God Himself, regardless of what is depicted there. That when these holy things are given to us through the church, it's actually, in a certain sense, it's the presence of God Himself, regardless of the depiction. So that's another element in the discussion. And I was thinking about the Ancient of Days that is depicted in some of these Trinity icons. It's actually a symbolical image depicting God the Father. So it takes on another layer of what you described there.
Yeah, if you ask the iconographers, they'll say, and actually the theologians also, I think, will say that the Ancient of Days, that was Christ, you know. And so, but it's true that when you see that the New Testament, everyone knows what this is. This icon we're talking about. There's the dove in the middle as the Holy Spirit, and then on the right side is a kind of older-looking man, and on the left side is Christ. Well, everyone looks at that as, oh, that's God the Father. Well, actually, it's not possible to depict God the Father in an icon, and so it's not really. Any kind of incarnation of God must be Christ by default. But it's a very controversial icon, I would say. Do you have anything to add to that from the... Okay.
I have a follow-up question, and actually all these questions have been raised already, but kind of a detailed follow-up. First, I remember I've seen the icons of Господь Вседержитель, so the Demigod. So they exist in, are they, so that's my first question, are they probably Greek icons? I remember one of the Greek ones.
Christ on the throne.
So was it before or after the Iconoclast movement, where how historically was there a ban on specifically not allowing those icons?
I don't know the history of this particular image. So I just know that Staglavy Russian council prohibited representation of God's Father because we haven't seen him.
So when you go to a church which is built traditionally, it will have a dome. And at the top of the dome, there is always God looking down. This is Christ.
I'm talking about the Greek icon, and I remember this with respect to Staragere, because it has those like two fingers blessing, and I visually remember it exists. I can't remember.
Deisis, Deisus, in Russian? Is that what you're thinking? Deisis? The Greek
Господь Вседержитель, Демиург, sometimes is called.
Usually on the beam. Is that?
We're talking about two different things here. So Natalia Yurevna is talking about an icon which would be pretty theologically suspect, which seems to be trying to depict God the Father, and some people are talking about an icon of Christ. So the church has generally been very reluctant. Well, basically, based on the iconophiles, you can't depict God the Father because no one has seen God the Father. You can only depict what you see. And that's why even I think we have a present day practice of sometimes we will have an icon with various saints in it together that never would have met each other at all because it's the saints of the family. You know, so you may have one saint from the 2nd century and one from the 20th century, you know, in the same icon. And I think that strictly speaking, probably, at that time, iconophiles would probably say that's not appropriate. What do you think? Because they never would have been together. You know, you can depict what you've seen, but to put two people together on an icon that would never have seen each other, what do you think? How would they react? So you have an icon that has Saint Mary of Egypt on it and Saint Innocent of Moscow. Okay, they never met except in the heavenly kingdom, and in this world they never met, but they are on the same icon. How do you think that the iconophiles would say? Is this allowed to have two saints on one icon that never would have been together?
It's hard to say for iconophiles, but this debate concerns only what we can depict. Who can depict the subject of the icon, not historical, how the icon can be organized, but who can be depicted, the portrait of Christ.
I mean, it doesn't bother me, but you see these, and I often wonder, you know, how would those people who were fighting this fight, how would they think of that? But that's interesting. Father Michael had something.
I was just going to say the simple answer is a Minean icon for a certain month.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Saints of different for each day and different centuries.
Yeah, yeah.
The second part of my question was the symbolism that so just and I was thinking if the symbolic representation, so for example the apostles who wrote the Gospels, you know, you see representations of them, you know, as a lion and you know, and also Jesus is represented as a lamb, right, in some older icons, maybe more in Western Church than in Eastern tradition too. So in this sense, maybe the God, you know, the Father, could be also thought of as a symbolic representation.
Yeah, they wanted to avoid the danger of monophysite heresy. So symbolical representation, it was like it goes together with monophysite heresy. So they wanted to show how, I give this quote, the height of God's humility, that he was in the flesh and he was man as well. So they wanted to stress this point, that's why they prohibited symbolical representation. They said we respect what was in how they represented the Christ in the form of lamb in the beginning, but from this point now on, because there was a danger of this monophysite heresy, we need to represent the way how we saw him in his human flesh.
Not just as God.
Forgive me. So this is all so very interesting and so important to us because we venerate icons, our homes are adorned with them, churches. Forgive me, it's different conversation.
Next week, maybe. Ken.
You brought this up just again, you brought it up earlier, the Monophysite heresy, dovetailing, I guess, with iconoclasm. This is the first time I've heard of this. Are Monophysites today considered iconoclasts? I mean, I think most, I guess, churches that I'm aware of that consider themselves or are considered as Monophysite have icons. So I'm just curious.
So you're curious whether they exist, whether they still exist,
Or whether, I mean, this linkage of Monophysitism and iconoclasm, is that, because I think Monophysite churches typically have icons, don't they? Or is this one of these things that iconoclasts would have icons that just pour a different meaning
at
into
that
it?
time, so this quote was from the 8th and 9th century, so probably at that time, this Patriarch Nikiphorus, the defender of icons in the Byzantine iconoclasm, he said it was monophysite heresy because monophysite heresy is against incarnation and therefore against representation.
There are two lines of monophysites. Well, more, actually, there's more. But there is at least one line that are iconoclasts. Assyrians or Jacobites. They don't have icons. So there are monophysites who use icons, but there are monophysites who are iconoclasts.
But they use very limited, they use maybe icons of the Savior and of the Mother of God and no others.
But there are some that have none.
Right.
They have white churches. The interior of their churches are white. There's nothing there. There's no depictions whatsoever.
They're like the Coptic church and the Ethiopian
Copts
church.
use icons. Ethiopians use icons. Armenians use icons. Yes. But there are some monophysites who don't use icons. John and then...
So let's be clear, the iconoclasm was a strictly Byzantine thing. The Copts and the Armenians never threw out all their icons. Is that correct?
I don't know the answer to that, if they ever did have the same issue that the Orthodox did. Do you know that within the Coptic Church?
Well, there were other Orthodox too. I mean, the Syrians and in Alexandria, it was strictly a Byzantine thing, right? Or
Protestants are contemporary iconoclasts, and the arguments, I participated in an online discussion group to defend the icons. I don't need to bring any of my own arguments. They just repeated word by word iconoclast of the 8th century. I just needed to control, copy, and paste John of Damascus, Theodore Christodidicus. They just repeated word by word the same arguments. So Protestants are contemporary iconoclasts.
But I think what John is asking is, was iconoclasm spread outside the Byzantine Empire? Outside Constantinople, basically, but still
Not
within
in the West. Not in the West.
And how about in Egypt and Alexandria, Jerusalem, places like that? Do you know if they had such issues, or it was only really
The whole
mostly
Byzantine
Constantinople?
Empire, so the monasteries and simple people, they were for icons, and almost all hierarchy was iconoclast at that time in the whole Byzantine Empire. I'm not sure about particular.
Well, it must be. I mean, St. John, your
was-
namesake, was
He was in
such
Jerusalem.
a icono duel. Obviously, that's pretty far south already.
yeah, that was under Arab control then.
In some of the modern teachings that are being distributed on Orthodox veneration of icons and such, the phrase theological reality is used regularly and heavily. That icons are used to depict not historical events necessarily, and not people that lived together in a historical setting necessarily. But when we see an icon, we see a theological representation of a theological reality. Is that a subtle way of dealing with many of these issues that we're talking about? Did you come across that saying as you were doing your research? Because I hear it all the time. If you listen to an MP3 on, whatever, from whichever teacher, that's kind of the way they're explaining them now. Theological realities. And in one sense, we can accept that. Obviously, the nativity of our Lord, it's a theological reality. There are things in it that no one saw, but that the eye of faith sees as it's revealed by God. That's the way I hear it being spoken of regularly nowadays.
Yeah, I'm not clear about this discourse.
So this wasn't the case in the iconoclast controversy. They weren't talking about this.
No, the conversation was what we depict. Appearance, soul, body, flesh.
What the image means.
What image, what portrait. Now icon for us means something else, like icon there is an object, but icon was a portrait. What is portrait of a person? Just his flesh, just his appearance, and here we got this nice dialectics, that nice term of hypostasis, person, dialectics of sameness and different.
Let us speak, and I'm going to go try to rein in the...
So my question is how close to the reality image should be or should be allowed? Like sometimes, we see icons that are more symbolic, right? Or kind of like more like Deacon Zach was telling how you actually paint an icon, right? It's not just regular painting. And sometimes I see icons that are so close to, like they really like 3D and you really see the person natural way, and how, or even like a lot of, in Catholic churches, they would have actually the statues. How is it close to, I don't know,
Yeah, the main,
wrong or right, or I don't know.
yeah, the main thing that icon needs to depict a person such a way that you can set him apart from everybody else. What is hypostasis? All features which help you to distinguish this, to recognize this person, distinguish him from anybody else. Like when you look at an icon of Saint Nicholas, you can tell right away this is Saint Nicholas. Even sometimes faces are different, but you can tell right away. So icon serves its purpose. So you know who it is in the icon. This is the main issue. Other details, they were not the issue during these disputes. As far as icon helps you to recognize the person, it serves its purpose.
Just for my identification, do we or do we not have icons where Christ is represented as a lamb? Or, because I think I'm getting confused between the things I saw in Western churches where you have lots of symbolic representations. Do we,
It was prohibited during the, let's say this way, they are not canonical.
okay,
Yes, just like icons of the Father.
uh-huh,
Of course they exist. Some person, anybody can paint anything. They can, but it's not canonical. It's not accepted by the church. So you don't find icons of Christ depicted as a lamb. There's actually a canon specifically against it. There are some canons that talk about iconography, and if I'm not mistaken, there is a canon specifically prohibiting that. Any other questions?
About the statues.
Oh, the question about the Roman Catholic
I don't
statues.
know about the statues.
So the reason in the East, paganism and the use of statues was so abhorrent to the Christians that the idea of depicting the saints in the same way, it just commingled those ideas too much, and they couldn't accept that. So apparently in the West, it didn't have that same level of people were just completely pushed away by that. They couldn't see that when they saw a statue, they thought paganism, and they just couldn't combine the two. So the concept of statues in the Orthodox Church just never grew. It just never happened. There are a couple of places where you can find statues in the Orthodox Church, but it's incredibly rare. One I can think of is on Balam. They found a statue of Saint Nicholas floating in the water, and they assumed that it came from Sweden, which maybe it did, I don't know. And so they thought, well, we're Orthodox and we don't do this, so they threw it back. And they kept finding it in the church with mud on its feet, and they said, forget it. Yeah, I can't remember, it's on one of the skeets. It's on one of the skeets. They kept throwing it back, and they would come the next morning, it would be in the church with mud on its feet from water. They said, all right, so, but it's very, very unusual to find statues in the Orthodox Church. Basically, you just don't find them. Any other questions?
Was there any, by that time, was there any miracle icons that they would think about what is going on, why is that they wouldn't, or something is
I think they were
lost?
miracle icons because there were debates about, there were some acts which indicates for me that they were miracle icons. Like when people try to put the paint from an icon and put it into the blood of Christ during the communion, so the status which, the role which icon started to play. So these examples, they tell me that probably, yes, they were miracle icons, so they were exalted, how to translate it.
Overjoyed.
Yeah, so people didn't know what
Any other questions? Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, Lilia. John has a box in his hands.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the box for the lunch donations, and every dollar